So, let me tell you about something that happened to me nearly a year ago. And I need you to hear me out on this one, because this story unraveled everything I thought I understood about trust, about the person sleeping beside me, about my own capacity to believe the worst. It all started with one single photograph. One image that a stranger showed me, a woman I'd never met, in the middle of a crowded gallery opening with champagne halfway to my lips and my wife somewhere across that same room. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My wife Sarah, she works at this architecture studio in the Arts District. She's been there for almost 4 years. And in those 4 years, I've heard a great deal about her creative director. His name is David. David approved her concept. David fought for her promotion. David says she has a rare eye for spatial narrative. I'm not going to lie to you. Hearing your wife speak about another man with that frequency, with that particular warmth in her voice. It does something to you. It plants something. You nurture it without consent. Every time she stays late to finalize renderings, every time she smiles at her phone and angles the screen away, every time she spends 40 minutes selecting an outfit for what she calls just a studio review. I trusted Sarah. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I trusted her. But trust and suspicion are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they occupy the same space, breathing the same air, refusing to acknowledge each other. So when she told me about this gallery opening, the annual showcase where the studio presents their residential work to potential clients and press, the formal event where partners are explicitly welcomed, I agreed immediately. Perhaps too quickly. She actually paused, looking at me with something like surprise, as if she'd anticipated resistance. I told her of course I'd be there, that I wanted to see what she'd been building. And I meant that. But beneath those words, yes, I wanted to see David. I wanted to attach a face to the name that had occupied my thoughts during sleepless hours. I wanted to measure something I couldn't quite define. The opening was held at this converted warehouse space you only visit when someone else's budget is covering the experience. The kind of venue where the concrete floors are polished to a mirror finish, the lighting is surgical and dramatic, and the caterers move through the crowd like silent performers. Sarah looked breathtaking that evening. She wore this emerald silk blouse I hadn't seen before, paired with charcoal trousers that made her look like she'd stepped out of one of her own renderings. When she emerged from our bedroom, I genuinely lost my train of thought mid-sentence. She caught my expression and told me I looked sharp myself. That was a good moment. The kind you try to preserve. We arrived and the space was already humming with bodies and conversation. White walls, exposed beams, projections showing architectural fly-throughs on loop. Her colleagues began approaching immediately, introducing themselves, and I performed the ritual of handshakes and name retention and appropriate smiling. Sarah was radiant. She was operating in her natural environment and I felt genuinely proud watching her navigate that room with such confidence. And then I noticed him. David was not what I'd constructed in my imagination. I don't know what I'd expected, exactly. Someone overtly charismatic, perhaps. Someone who radiated the easy authority of physical attractiveness. But David was simply a man. Tall, certainly, well-presented, obviously. But there was something almost reserved about him. Like someone who had long ago stopped performing for anyone's approval. He was engaged in conversation near the bar, gesturing with his hands as he explained something. When he laughed, it was restrained, genuine. The kind of laugh that suggested he found actual amusement rather than performing it. Sarah touched my elbow and guided me toward him. She introduced me as her husband, Alex. He turned, and here is what struck me. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you've already formed an opinion you're waiting to confirm. Not hostile, more like assessing, as if comparing me against some internal standard. He extended his hand and I shook it and he told me that she talks about me. Just that. She talks about me. And then he smiled and turned back to his conversation. She talks about me. What did that mean? The specificity of it, the incompleteness. I turned that phrase over in my mind for the next 30 minutes while people circulated and the first round of presentations began. I was positioned across the room from Sarah, separated by the geometry of the crowd, which felt deliberate somehow. We kept catching each other's eyes, exchanging small smiles, and I instructed myself to relax, stop this, be present, enjoy the evening. The work on display was impressive, genuinely. I studied models and drawings of spaces I couldn't afford, drinking champagne that tasted like it had been selected by someone with exacting standards. The conversations around me were sophisticated, warm. Sarah's colleagues were clearly talented people, the kind of environment where 2 hours compress into what feels like minutes. And then the room settled into that comfortable rhythm of a successful event, where the initial energy has mellowed into sustained engagement and the noise level finds its equilibrium. David was several meters away, partially obscured by a structural column, so I couldn't observe him directly without repositioning. But I heard his voice. He possessed that particular tone that projects without effort. The conversation near him grew momentarily animated, several people laughing, and I instinctively looked over, shifting my stance slightly. And David, at that precise moment, also adjusted his position and looked directly at me as if he'd been anticipating my attention. He had this expression, knowing, controlled. He raised his champagne flute in a subtle gesture, then moved through the crowd toward me with purpose. He stopped beside me and told me he needed to show me something. The words were quiet, intimate in their delivery, though the room continued its noise around us. Sarah, I saw her glance up from a conversation nearby, not alarmed, but attentive. And David withdrew his phone from his pocket, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward me. On it was a photograph. Sarah and David, standing close together in what appeared to be the studio after hours. Her head was tilted back in laughter. His hand was on her shoulder. The timestamp was from 3 weeks prior. A Thursday. She'd told me she was working late that Thursday. She had. But she hadn't mentioned this. I didn't react immediately, because I had prepared myself for many possibilities that evening. I had prepared for awkwardness. I had prepared for subtle provocations I would analyze later. I had prepared for the kind of moment that becomes ammunition in the silence of a car ride home. I was not prepared for this. I was not prepared for the casualness of the revelation, for the way David simply held the phone there, waiting for my response, for the fact that Sarah was now moving toward us with measured steps, her expression carefully arranged. I looked at the image again. The intimacy of it. The ease between them. The hour. I asked him why he was showing me this. My voice came out level, which surprised me. David put his phone away and told me it was because he thought I'd been wondering, and that wondering is worse than knowing. He paused and told me that she's extraordinary, my wife. The way she sees space, the way she understands how people move through rooms. It's rare. He tells her this constantly. He suspects I don't. The words landed like individual blows. Precise and calculated. Sarah reached us then, and the three of us stood in this terrible triangle of unspoken history. She told me she could explain. But I didn't want explanation. Not then. I wanted to understand what I'd been missing. What I'd been refusing to see. The seed I'd mentioned earlier, the one I'd been watering unconsciously. It wasn't about David at all. It was about me. My own terror that I had become insufficient. That somewhere in the progression of our marriage, I had transformed into the person she came home to out of habit rather than desire. The man who asked about her day without genuinely listening, who forgot to book the restaurant for her birthday, who fell asleep during the films she selected. That suspicion I'd been cultivating, the one that had found a convenient target in David's name. It was never really about him. It was about my own fear that I had become background noise in the life of the person I loved most. And this man I'd constructed as some kind of latent threat, had just handed me evidence of my worst fears with the demeanor of someone performing a service. Watching Sarah in that moment, watching her face cycle through emotions I couldn't fully read, something fundamental shifted in my understanding. Not toward clarity. Toward complexity. After the presentation concluded, people began dispersing toward the exit, collecting coats, making arrangements for continued conversations elsewhere. I found myself standing near the entrance with a glass of water I didn't remember accepting, watching Sarah across the room. She was speaking with a potential client, gesturing with her hands the way she always does when she's translating vision into language. And she was so fully present, so completely herself in that element. And I thought, when did I stop witnessing this? When did I stop acknowledging out loud what I observed when I watched her work? David appeared beside me again. And it felt inevitable at that point. This recurrence. He stood there, watching the same scene I was watching, and told me quietly that just so I understand, she talks about me differently than she talks about anyone else. I didn't respond. He continued, explaining that when she describes her projects, she's professional, detailed, precise. When she mentions me, she becomes uncertain. She asks his opinion about things. Whether she's being unreasonable in her expectations. Whether she's asking too much. He paused and told me about the day they photographed that project, the one I'd seen. She spent 20 minutes adjusting her appearance before he took that picture. Not for him. She kept saying she wanted to look like someone I'd be proud to claim. I had to look away because the narrative I'd been constructing for months, the Sarah who was withdrawing, the Sarah who had professionally outpaced me, the Sarah who seemed more alive in her studio than in our home, that was only the surface reading. The real story was that she was frightened. The same way I was frightened. She was simply frightened of a different exposure. She was terrified that the person who knew her most completely would observe her in her professional context and find her wanting. That the life she'd constructed beyond our domestic sphere wouldn't appear substantial enough to the one person whose judgment she couldn't dismiss. We had been occupying identical fear in the same spaces for months, and we had somehow never thought to simply confess it. The drive home that night was different. Not cinematic, not dramatically transformed. Different in that subtle, authentic way where you can sense the atmospheric pressure between two people altering. Sarah had removed her shoes before we reached the parking structure, holding them in her lap, her head resting against the passenger window. I was driving and I asked, without planning the words, why she hadn't told me she was worried about my reaction tonight. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked why I hadn't told her I was worried about David. I laughed. She laughed. And within that shared sound was nearly a year of accumulated tension beginning to dissolve. Not entirely. Not immediately. But sufficiently. Sufficiently to breathe. She asked what David had said to me by the entrance. I told her. She didn't speak for a long stretch of road. Then she told me that he's perceptive, sometimes uncomfortably so. I told him he'd shown me a photograph of them together, late evening, alone. She turned to look at me and explained they were celebrating a project approval. The team had left. She stayed to finish documentation. He stayed because he's the director and he wanted to mark the moment. Nothing happened, she told me. Nothing has ever happened. I told her I knew. Because I did. I had known, even in the moment of seeing that image. The fear had been louder than the knowledge, but the knowledge had remained. We arrived home and the house appeared exactly as it always had. And we stood in the kitchen for several minutes, performing no particular task. Then Sarah looked at me and told me she is proud of what we've built. She knows she demonstrates that poorly. She knows she disappears into work and she knows she makes me feel like I'm competing with something I can't see. I told her I know. I told her I make her feel like her achievements are threats rather than celebrations. I don't say enough. I don't say the important things with enough frequency. She nodded and then she told me we should address that. So simple. We should address that. As if it were merely a maintenance issue we'd been deferring. And in a sense, I suppose it was. Here is what I want you to understand, because I recognize this is more than a gallery anecdote. I recognize you're listening because something in this account resonates with something in your experience. Perhaps it's not a creative director at a professional event. Perhaps it's an entirely different configuration. But that sensation, that quiet encroaching certainty that you are progressively becoming less significant to the person you love most, or that they are transforming into someone you cannot maintain pace with, that sensation will consume you if you permit it. Not because it's accurate, but because you never verify it. You never simply ask. You never sit in the vehicle on the return journey and articulate the actual thought you're harboring. I had constructed an entire alternative reality based exclusively on silence and assumption. I had transformed a man's name into a symbol for everything I feared about myself. And that man had turned out to be someone who perceived my wife with a clarity I had been neglecting, and who used that perception to hand us back to each other. There is a version of that evening that could have proceeded very differently. I could have entered defensive, barriers raised, awaiting confirmation of all my anxieties. I could have been abrupt with David, or cold, or spent the entire event cataloging evidence for my own narrative of betrayal. And Sarah would have felt that. She would have driven home beside someone who had closed, and she would have closed in response, and we would have retired to sleep in proximity but in separation, 6 months more distant than when we'd awakened. But something about that photograph, about being forced to confront my fear directly rather than allowing it to circulate in speculation. Something about being asked to acknowledge what I saw, not as her husband defending territory but as a person recognizing truth, returned me to myself. To the self that actually loves her completely, without the interference of insecurity. It's been nearly a year now. We're not perfected. We still drift occasionally. Still experience periods where routine obscures connection. But now we name those periods. Now one of us will say that we feel like we're operating as cohabitants this week. And the other will respond that they feel that too. And we'll implement something minor to interrupt it. A genuine conversation, a shared walk, asking each other questions we don't already know the answers to. And sometimes when I observe her across a room in that way I did at the opening, alive, fully herself, capable of achievements that genuinely impress me, I tell her. I articulate it, because apparently I was significantly deficient in that practice before and apparently it matters more than I understood. The final thing I'll say is this. That night when we finally retired, the house was dark and quiet and Sarah was nearly asleep and she told me, partially into her pillow, that she's glad I was there. And I told her I wouldn't have missed it. And she reached across and held my hand in the darkness and said nothing further. And that was sufficient. That was the entirety. One photograph from a man I'd feared for months. One honest vehicle journey home. One kitchen conversation that lasted perhaps 10 minutes. And a hand held in darkness. Sometimes that is all that is required to find your way back. Not a grand gesture. Not an extended dialogue that resolves everything. Just one honest moment where both parties cease performing and begin remembering who they are to each other. If you're listening to this now and something in this narrative felt familiar, that quiet distance, that unexpressed fear, perhaps that is your indication. Not to spiral. Not to assume the worst. Simply to initiate the return journey conversation. Simply to express the thought you've been containing. Probability suggests the person beside you has been containing a corresponding thought. And perhaps all that is required is for someone to begin.